All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to video 2. This video will discuss officer deviance. Okay, so officers must not only be above reproach, but you also have to appear to be that way in both personal and professional lives. When you're a police officer, especially in small towns, you really have to be careful about what you do. You know, for example, I worked in small towns for most of my career. I couldn't go out and do stuff like normal people. Like I couldn't go out and have a couple beers with my buddies for several reasons. But one of which was I didn't want people to talk. You know, I didn't want them to start spreading rumors that I was a drunk or that I was out, doing whatever. And then you get that reputation, as doing deviant stuff, even if you weren't. Okay, so you really have to be careful when you're a police officer, not only what you do, but how people perceive what you're doing. And also as an officer, you can be disciplined for things that you're doing off duty. It's different than other occupations. Not that you can't get disciplined for things you do when you're not at work other places, because you obviously can. You can get fired for things. But it's a kind of a different deal with police officers. All right, anyway, let's get into this. So there's going to be kind of several definitions we're going to discuss in this section, and it's important to distinguish them. Unfortunately, media will often use some of these terms interchangeably, even though they have different meanings. So first, let's define police misconduct. Police misconduct is a police act or omission that violates legal rules. So misconduct can be something the police do or something they don't. Okay, sins of commission or sins of omission. So if they choose not to do it when they should have done something about it. Police deviance is similar, but it's police behavior that does not conform to standards of norms or expectations. So misconduct is legal, deviance is norms and expectations. And standards can be ethical, organizational, or legal. Ethical standards are principles of appropriate conduct that are internal to the officer. Organizational standards are formal and informal, and those are policy, procedures, rules, regulations, where the organization tells you what your ethics are. And then legal, of course, are based on laws. So if you think about these standards, there's clearly some opportunity for them to conflict, which makes any discussion of deviance complicated, kind of minimally, and also makes deviance almost impossible for an officer to avoid. So think about it for a minute. If breaking policy is considered deviance, and you have a policy manual that has 1,000 pages of policy and procedures in it, how would it be possible for an officer not to break policy if that's what you're calling deviance? Okay, so just think about this for a minute. Now, obviously, when people talk about deviance, usually they're talking about really, really bad stuff. But when you get into kind of what deviance really is, it's some of this kind of minor stuff too. So just kind of keep that in your mind. All right, so types of deviance. Kane and White really kind of got into this. They sorted through 21 years of information, and they came up with 8 categories. I'm not going to go over all 8 of those, but be sure you go over them. You'll see that there's both on-duty categories and off-duty categories. Okay, some other definitions. One of the reasons we have so many definitions and terms is because police deviance has been a pretty popular research topic, and people like to create their own terms and definitions. So Kapler, Sluter, and Alpert, those guys are all really well-known police researchers. They provide definitions for occupational deviance as an activity that does not conform to standards and is committed during the normal course of work activities or under the guise of police officers' authority. So occupational deviance is something that happens that doesn't conform to standards, that's done during normal work activities. Police corruption involves the use of power and authority for personal gain, and then abuse of authority has 3 elements. Officers may physically assault or abuse others through the use of excessive force. Officers may psychologically abuse citizens through verbal assault, harassment, ridicule, or officers may violate a citizen's constitutional, federal, or state rights. So these definitions by Kapler and his buddies are commonly used in policing literature when discussing police misconduct. So how prevalent is deviance? It's very hard to gauge how much police deviance is occurring. There's limited studies because it's hard to study, right? Asking people about their deviance, it's hard to do. People don't want to admit that stuff. It's hard to get permission to come into a police agency and do that kind of research, right? Because they may not even want to know like how much of that stuff's going on. So it appears that some type of deviance is widespread. Again, remember what we talked about, definitions of deviance. And then the other issue with studies is what kind of deviance is being studied. Okay, so trying to gauge how much police deviance is occurring, like what kind of deviance are we talking about? How are they looking at it, right? So really knowing how much police deviance is out there is really, really, really hard. All right, deviant officers. Most police officers do not become corrupt police officers. There's only a small percentage that commit illegal activity. It's just like the regular population, right? Most people are not corrupt people. There's only a small percentage that commit the crimes, right? We've talked about that a couple times already. Okay, so the Knapp Commission, so NYPD has had a long kind of tradition of having problems with deviance. So the Knapp Commission was appointed to investigate them, and they developed these two typologies for corrupt police officers. One was grass eaters, one was meat eaters. So grass eaters are police officers that essentially accept graft when it becomes available. They don't go looking for it. They don't try to find it, but if it's there, not afraid to take advantage. Meat eaters, on the other hand, actively and aggressively go out looking for it. They're soliciting opportunities for financial gain, involved in serious corruption. Like, meat eaters, that's what they do, right? They want to get involved in corruption. So, which is worse, grass eaters or meat eaters? Well, the Knapp Commission found grass eaters were actually more of a problem than the meat eaters. And you think, how could that possibly be? Well, there's way more grass eaters, right? There's very few meat eaters. There's way more grass eaters. And because you have all these grass eaters, they've created this kind of wall of silence to protect themselves. But in the meantime, when they create this wall of silence, the meat eaters are behind that wall. And it allows the meat eaters to do what they do because the grass eaters don't want to start admitting things are happening because then they might get caught up in something. So because there's so many more grass eaters, it actually creates a situation where the meat eaters can thrive. And then Barker came along and expanded on those Knapp typologies and identified 5 types of officers. You have the white knights, who are totally honest and really might take an extreme stance on their honesty. You have straight shooters that are honest, but for themselves, but are willing to overlook discretions by their officers. Then you have the grass eaters, you have your meat eaters, and then you have rogues. And rogues are like meat eaters on steroids. Okay, and those guys are the ones that are participating directly in criminal activity. So who are these officers that participate in corruption? Why do they participate in corruption? Well, research has unsurprisingly found that officers with prior criminal histories are more likely to participate in corruption. Those that have more education were less likely to. So those are two things. So think about this. We were talking about selection already, right? We talked about some of these agencies are starting to kind of reevaluate their pre-employment requirements. And criminal histories are part of that. And they've started kind of thinking about, well, there's some things we ought to overlook and let them, so think about what this means now. They found people with prior criminal histories are more likely to participate in corruption. Those with education, more education, were less likely. So they're talking about lowering education. They're talking about maybe accepting more different types of prior criminal history. Yeah, just think about that. They also found officers assigned to disadvantaged communities were more likely because it provided more opportunity. And also think about the power relationships in those communities versus less disadvantaged communities. Okay, there's a much more stark power difference between those two types of communities. Okay, and then they also found that just like crime that occurs in hotspots, so does police corruption. Police corruption is not spread evenly across all police departments. There's hotspots. Certain places, there's more of it. Will corruption persist? It most likely will. It's been around forever. It'll most likely continue at least to some degree, because it's impossible to always screen out those that are prone to this type of behavior, especially when you're talking about very large departments. But why does it persist? Why can't, so the police are powerful. They operate without close supervision most of the time. They constantly encounter opportunities to participate in corruptions. Things like community and political environment are influential in their attitudes toward corruption. So if you have more corruption in government, more corruption in businesses, there's more police corruption. It's also impossible for police officers to follow every directive and policy. There's widespread tolerance among some citizens for certain forms of police deviance. Citizens don't always want the police to play fair when it comes to arresting certain types of criminals. Pattern behaviors can become standards. And this is like almost, I don't want to call it a habit, but almost, right? Think about this. Patterns of behavior become standards of behavior. So the more you do something, the more commonplace it becomes. Okay? Think about that in all facets of your life. The more you do things, the easier it is to do things. So the more corruption people participate in, the easier it is to keep participating in corruption. So we have the systemic theory of corruption, and that says that corruption stems from the nature of police work. And if anti-corruption standards are inadequate, then corruption occurs. And then the rotten apple theory says corruption is limited to just a few officers, right? Kind of like, think about a bushel of apples. And there are a few rotten apples in a barrel of otherwise good apples. So this explanation is actually compatible with that. Remember the predispositional theory of behavior from the last video? Well, this is compatible with that. But think about what happens when you have rotten apples. Okay, so the problem with rotten apples is that if you don't get rid of them, the rottenness spreads to other good apples, right? If you have something rotten in a bag of fruit or wherever, like that rottenness spreads. All right, gratuities. So gratuities are really one of the most perplexing and shall we say controversial types of deviance. Okay, so a gratuity is the acceptance of anything of value. Coffee, meals, tickets, fountain sodas, things like that. Most commonly it's free meals, coffee, fountain sodas, half-price stuff. That's what it is most of the time. It's very, very common. Most places have, or most departments have policies against it. The International Association of Chiefs of Police considers it to be unethical. If an officer takes gratuities, they may be unwittingly undermining their legitimacy, could possibly be endangering future promotions, possibly lose their job, right? Because it's against policy. So businesses often do it to encourage police officers to frequent their establishment because they like having officers around, especially 24-hour establishments. So is this ethical? Well, it depends where you come down on this thing. Like this is, some forms of police deviance misconduct, like very clear, everybody kind of agrees, right? And there are people that completely disagree with gratuities. There's people that are like, whatever, we don't care. So there was one time when I was working, we had a range day, and our boss wanted to go to Taco Bell. Which, fine, right? But we knew that the Taco Bell, close to the range, gave free food to officers. And our boss was very strict. You will not take free food. So we're like, okay, but we went to Taco Bell. So we made him go first. Because we're like, we're not going to be up there. We're not going to get in that argument with the people. So he's standing there, orders his food, and tries to pay for it. The young lady behind the counter said, "Sir, you can't pay for it." He said, "Well, I'd really like to pay for it." She said, "You can't." He said, "What do you mean I can't?" She said, "It's our policy that officers get free food." He said, "Well, I'd really like to pay for it." She said, "Sir, I'll be fired if I let you pay for this food." So finally, it's lunchtime. Some guy in the back just yelled, "Just take the food." So What do you do in that situation? I tell that story because that shows you how unclear some of these things are. Like some of these places, like they won't let police officers not take the food. Now, they could avoid those places, for sure, right? They know Taco Bell makes you take free food, and they don't want free food. Then obviously you don't go to Taco Bell. But some of this stuff is not so clean cut. Okay, that's one reason I tell that story. All right, police sexual misconduct. All right, sexual misconduct by the police, like this could take a lot of different forms, related to a variety of factors inherent to policing: authority, power, low amounts of supervision, secluded contact with citizens. Hard to measure how much it occurs because the behavior is rarely reported. Sometimes misconduct is things like rapes, attempted rapes, sexual assault, but it can also be things like pulling somebody over to get a better look at them, kind of voyeurism kind of stuff. Officer-initiated consensual sexual contact, citizen-initiated sexual contact, performing unnecessary like pat-down searches, stuff like that. But you got to remember, like consensual contacts between officers and citizens that occurred when the officer is on duty. Okay, that's different than a consensual contact between two citizens because there's a power imbalance here between the officer and the person. So how do you stop this stuff? Starts with departmental policies. Like departmental policies need to explicitly prevent these type of behaviors. If you look in the book, I believe it was 30% when the study was done. It was found that 30% of agencies had sexual misconduct policy. Only 30% at the time of that study. Citizens also should be encouraged to levy complaints against officers. While it's rare, this type of behavior can damage a police department's credibility. And this kind of stuff happens probably more than you realize. I know several situations. I knew an officer one time that was married and go pick up his girlfriend in his patrol car while he was working and ride her around all day and do whatever. It needs to be clear. That's one of those things everybody knew, but nobody did anything about it. So there's ways to stop this kind of stuff. All right, drug war and police deviance. Okay, drug corruption among police is a serious problem. Why? There's lots of money in drugs. Okay, and it pays these drug cartels to bribe police and get police to look the other way. Okay, there's 4 kinds of drug corruption. You have use corruption, where officers are using drugs. You have economic corruption, where officers seek economic benefit, such as keeping money that's seized. Police violence, which is used to extract confessions. And then you have subjugation of defendants' rights, where you're planting drugs, committing perjury, that sort of thing. One of the kind of controversial aspects of this drug stuff is civil asset forfeiture. Now, civil asset forfeiture in and of itself is not corruption. But it's a tool that allows the assets of someone to be forfeited to the government if they were used to facilitate a crime or if they were the fruits of some kind of criminal behavior. So if somebody made a bunch of money doing something and they bought a boat, that boat would be the fruits of criminal behavior and it could then be seized and then forfeited to the government. If you're talking about drug trafficking, you're talking about large and lucrative, kind of assets. The interesting thing about civil asset forfeiture is that these are civil matters, they're not criminal. So the standard of proof is lower than a criminal case. It's just preponderance of evidence as opposed to probable cause, which is a much lower standard. So you end up with sometimes assets are forfeited and the owner is never even charged with a crime. Or in exchange for not being prosecuted, they'll forfeit their assets. So think about how that can become pretty controversial pretty quick. There's a lot of questions raised about civil forfeiture, especially when you look at departments that derive a bunch of money from it. So are they seizing these assets to make money, or is this really doing what they're supposed to be doing? Okay. So again, remember, civil asset forfeiture is in no way suggest the department is corrupt for doing it. There's very legitimate reasons for assets to be forfeited. The only point here about all this is sometimes it can be questionable. And then kind of the last thing I want to talk about with drug corruption, and really toward the end of this video here, is what they call noble cause corruption. And the author put it in with the drug stuff, but really this stuff can happen anywhere. Noble cause corruption can happen in any context. When the police abandon the ethical and legal means in order to achieve the good end. Okay, this is the sausage theory. It doesn't matter how the sausage is made, just that it is, right? What happens over here doesn't matter as long as we get over here. All right. It's the end of video 2. I'm going to stop there. So please, again, be sure to complete the readings, complete your assignments. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you next week.